The fundamental thing about a Fairlie, as opposed to a conventional steam engine, is that it's an articulated loco. Articulated, the idea being that the loco can go round much sharper curves than a conventional engine of the same sort of size could. Articulated means that the locomotive has, we call them bogies. This here, this part of the loco down here, is what we call the bogie. It's got the wheels and the cylinders and a frame, and at the other end of the loco is one just the same. The thing about these bogies is that they can turn independently underneath the loco. So that means although we've got quite a long loco, because these bogies can turn under the engine, then the loco can go around quite sharp curves. Say with this size of loco here, this is our new Fairlie James Spooner. A conventional loco of this size wouldn't be able to get around the curves we've got on the Ffestiniog railway. So Fairlies were developed for lines with sharp curves that needed larger locomotives to haul heavier loads. So to save double-heading conventional steam engines, the articulated Fairlie loco was developed. There were some predecessors that were sort of successful, but I suppose Robert Francis Fairlie was the big exponent of earlier articulated locos, and quite a number were sold around the world, particularly in the 1870s, that sort of time. I know a lot were built for Mexico, places like that. But now, here on the Ffestiniog Railway is where I think the only place in the world that's running Fairlie locos, and we've come to rely on them on the Ffestiniog because they suit the line very well with its sharp curves, and although there are some maintenance disadvantages with the Fairlie loco, some other disadvantages, they suit the railway very well indeed. Basically, a double Fairlie boiler looks like two boilers stuck back to back. This being the join line in the middle here. This is the fireman's side of David Lloyd George. Now, actually, it's one boiler, so that this space up here where the steam collects above the fireboxes. It's one common steam space and one common water level runs right through this boiler. However, there are two fireboxes, and they're quite separate. Now the reason is because to separate the fires is that because the exhaust from each bogie at each end is pulling the draft on the fire. If it was one common fire, then there could result in problems in that if one end of the loco is working a bit harder than the other, then you might actually get to a situation where you're sucking gas back down the chimney of the other end, which would obviously lead to some problems. So I think early in the double Fairlie development, it was decided that there should be two fireboxes, two sets of tubes, two chimneys, so that effectively it's like two boilers, but it is actually one boiler with a common water level, so and common steam space and therefore pressure. So here you see the fireman's got a gauge glass that tells him the level of water in the boiler here. That's very important that the water stays in this zone. If it goes too low, then the top of the fireboxes might become uncovered, and that leads to a failure. If the water level gets too high, then water might be carried over to the cylinders, and that's called priming. That makes the engine go very badly indeed. Why should one end of the engine be working harder than the other? Well, that can happen because you see the two red handles up in the middle there. Those are the driver's regulator controls, and there's one for each end of the engine, so that effectively the driver is controlling two different engines at once. So he can make, say, that end work much harder than this end, should he want to. Actually, in normal service, the engine will work much better if both ends are working reasonably evenly. But it's quite often the case that the uphill end of the loco is worked a bit harder. That's because I mentioned the water can get carried over. Being such a long boiler, if you're going up a gradient, then obviously the water is going to be at a higher level in the boiler at that end than that end, just because of the gradient. And so the water in the downhill end will be nearer the takeoff point, which is in the dome. And so the downhill end of a Fairlie, double Fairlie, will always be a little bit more prone to priming. So it's kind of normal practice when you're driving one of these that you might work the uphill end a little bit harder. The driver's got two regulator controls, so he can operate supply the steam independently to each end. But when we go round to the other side of the loco, you'll see there is actually only one reverser. So you can't decide to have one end pulling one way and one end pulling the other way, and that will clearly be a bad idea. So that the reverser that controls the direction and the amount of notching up that each engine is doing, that's common for both power bogies. Here is one of the bogies from the David Lloyd George. As you can see, it's a reasonably compact unit that is relatively easily taken out from under the loco and worked on. The bogie at the other end is pretty much identical, and indeed the bogies from all our Fairlies are pretty much interchangeable. There are differences, inevitably, because they've all been worked on at different times and slightly different modifications, but basically they're the same design, and it's essentially the same design that was there from the 1860s when the first double Fairlie, the Little Wonder, was built for the FR. The design's been improved over the years, and in modern times we've made detail improvements, but basically the design is just as it was. So you've got the pivot area here. This cast iron plate takes all the weight of the loco, and that fits up inside the cradle frame, and this plate is able to turn on top of the bogie, and that gives it the articulated action that enables the bogie to turn under the loco. The front here, the cylinders and steam chest, and people often ask, well, how does the steam get in and out of the cylinders and steam chest if the bogie is moving? Well, obviously making the joints that take the steam from the boiler to the cylinders and back out again, keeping those steam tight are very important, and obviously they need to move freely so that the bogie can turn under the loco. The steam, the live steam from the boiler now comes from above, somewhere here at the bottom of the smoke box. The pipe's removed at the moment, but it will. We now use a system of stainless steel flexible hoses that loop around this leading axle under and into the steam chest down there. So that's got those flexible hoses have quite a degree of movement. That's what we use on the engines currently, but in the past that live steam's been transmitted by a series of bronze ball joints coming basically in the same route but down here and into the cylinders. The exhaust leaves the cylinders here, and this pipe coming up here is the exhaust pipe, and if I do this you can see that it can articulate side to side quite freely. That's because there's a ball on the bottom end of that pipe, and that ball is sealed by PTFE sealing rings. In Victorian times they didn't have PTFE, they used bronze. There's a similar ball and a pipe at the top here inside the smoke box, and the upper pipe can slide up and down here, which enables the bogie to pitch up and down relative to the loco without smashing the pipes or destroying the seals. Okay, this bogie has come out from under the loco for a winter overhaul. You can see the wheel treads are nice and shiny. They've been reprofiled, and the rod ends have been remachined and remade. At the moment, the valve gear, which sits in here, is dismantled for overhaul. These are the 4 eccentrics that drive the valve gear, which is under there. Now the other thing that makes a Fairlie different from a conventional loco is the reversing gear, which on a conventional engine it'd be quite straightforward to have rods coming along to control the valve gear off the driver's reverser control. However, on a Fairlie, of course, you've got the problem that this bogie is turning under the loco as it goes around curves. So to accommodate that, the reversing gear needs to be able to articulate and move as well. Now, this big long rod here is we call it the bridle rod. I guess it's a bit like a bridle arrangement on a horse. But what it does is that it one end ends up fastened into the valve gear down here, can move the valve gear from forward to back gear. The other end is attached up on a way shaft underneath on the boiler cradle frame. So this rod is bridging from the bogie to the main boiler cradle frame, so it has to articulate. Now, back in Victorian times, to do that there was a system of, on each end of the rod there's an arrangement of pins and large pins in different orientations so that the movement could be accommodated. We've found in more, as obviously that's subject to wear, and so we found that a modern off-the-shelf solution was to use automotive prop shaft joints, universal joints, and that's what we've got here on the end of this rod now. These are actually Land Rover universal joints that you might find on the prop shaft of your car, but we've used them on each end of the bridle rod in order to accommodate the movement, and they've proved very successful indeed. They're very well engineered, they're off the shelf available, so if there's a problem you can just replace them. but they're very reliable, and eliminating slack in that reversing gear is quite important for the loco to run smoothly and not rattle as it's going along. So this is the driver's side of the James Spooner, our new Fairlie, and I was talking about the reversing gear. This is the driver's reverser control. As I said, there's only one reverser, so this reverser controls both bogies' valve gear. Now, this has been put together temporarily for us to check that everything's fitting. We've just put the new boiler in this loco, so we've already got the reversing gear together. So basically, the way this works is that this is what the driver would call mid-gear, so that if you applied steam, in theory the loco won't go in either direction. So if we want to go that way, the driver pushes this forward in that direction. There's a locking catch here, and you can see that's moving both of these rods in that direction also, and then that movement comes to this arm here, and then there's a shaft, or the waste shaft, running across the loco cradle frame there, with another arm pointing down, and that arm is what pushes that bridle rod we were looking at earlier. Right, so here we've got the one end of the new boiler. You can see this is where the main steam pipe comes out of the boiler. There'll be a superheater header bolted on here, and the superheater elements will take the steam through the flues and then back to the header, having been superheated. And then from the hot side of the header, main steam pipe will run down and out the bottom of the smoke box, off down to the cylinders we were looking at before. What's missing from here at the moment, obviously, is the smoke box itself, which is a big round drum that'll be fitted round here, and the smoke box door on the front about here. That's not there at the moment because we're still working on the boiler. You can see the two flue tubes have been fitted, but the small tubes have yet to be fitted. They're being prepared here, ready to go into the boiler. There's, I think there's 114 in this small tubes in this boiler. We've made a bit of hopefully an improvement down here. This cut-out bottom area will hopefully catch a lot of the char and stuff that tends to accumulate in the smoke box. So instead of accumulating against the boiler tube plate here, it will drop into this sump, and it'll be easier to clean out the bottom of the smoke box with this area here. Yeah, these are the boiler tubes. We've been preparing them to be fitted by warming up the ends of the tubes to sort of a reasonably red sort of temperature, and then allowing them to cool slowly, which tends to slightly soften them and make sure they're not hard. It's a process called normalising. And then the ends of the tubes are wire brushed very smooth and clean. You see those have been done there. That's to ensure that when they're expanded in place in the boiler, there's a very good seal made between the tube plate and the tube itself, because obviously we don't want to have any leaks. this is the Merddin Emrys, which is it was the first locomotive built here at Boston Lodge Workshops, finished in 1879. It wasn't the first Fairlie for the Ffestiniog Railway. That was a little wonder that was built earlier, and then the James Spooner was built for the FR by Avonside, but the Merddin Emrys was the first one built here. And as you can see, it's pretty much complete. It's ready for the coming season pretty much. The Merddin has been working on the Ffestiniog since it was built in the 1870s. It's been rebuilt many times. It's had several new boilers and new tanks, and different the bogies have been swapped. However, essentially the design is much as the original was built, and it's still essentially used as it was originally intended back in the 1870s, although not, instead of hauling slate wagons and some passenger trains, now it basically hauls all passenger trains. So it remains one of our most useful locos. It can easily pull 10, 12 carriages on the FR. Back in Victorian times, all the double Fairlies had the injectors both on the driver's side, and the firemen back then were referred to as stokers. So basically their job was to keep the fire in order. It was the driver was also important in looking after the boiler, in that he was controlling the water level, and from that also the pressure in the boiler. Merddin's still got an injector, both injectors on the driver's side. The other double Fairlies have got one on each side now, so that the fireman can choose to put water in, or the driver can choose to put water in. This is looking into the smoke box on the Merddin Emrys. You can't see a lot in here because it's got these screens in front, and these are very important for our operation now. They're spark arrestor screens, and the mesh is designed to catch any large particles that of unburnt or burning coal that could get ejected out of the chimney. So you can see only quite small pieces can get through, and the idea of that is that by preventing the large pieces, then the smaller pieces, by the time it's gone out of the chimney, then they'll be too small to cause a line-side fire. That's the way it works, and it's generally pretty effective. Here's the fireman's side of the Merddin Emrys. One of the disadvantages of a Fairlie loco is that the space available can be pretty limited, and that's space available for the crew and for the water and coal on the loco, compared to a conventional engine, and particularly a tender engine. However, it does all work. You can operate it, obviously. So you've got the two fire holes with doors, and in each end of the loco on the fireman's side there's a coal bunker. So this door here opens the coal bunker, and the fireman can shovel out of here. You can see some coal. Open the fire hole door and into the fire. Now, as you can see, that's slightly odd compared to a normal loco. He's got to deal with two fires that might be burning differently if one end's working harder than the other, or something might have happened in one fire. So fireman's got to manage two fires, and he's got two coal bunkers, and he's got very limited space, particularly on the Ffestiniog Railway, where there's not much clearance between the cab side and the walls. It could be just here, so the firemen have to be pretty sharp to look after all that and keep themselves safe. The thing the fireman's got, he's got a handbrake for the loco. That's this handle here. Applies the hand parking brake of the loco, and he's got a couple of two controls here which control the blowers. They make artificial draft at each end of the loco to draw the fire when the loco's not working hard and creating its own draft. Right, here's one end of Merthin Emrys on top. What have we got? There's a coal bunker. Same at the other end on the fireman's side. Obviously the driver hasn't got a coal bunker on this side. He's got a toolbox which you can put various bits and pieces in. But the water tanks there are 4 tanks basically. Here's the water filler for this fireman's side tank, and the tank goes down and underneath the bunker and is actually connected to all 3 other tanks by pipes, so that you can fill the loco's water tanks from one point only if you need to. Although the water level doesn't always balance that quickly, so you might see firemen swapping from one filler on one side to one filler on the other side. There's a driver's side one. This tapering bit is actually a bit of dummy cladding to make the loco look like it's got a tapered boiler or a wagon top boiler, which is what it carried originally. Actually, this boiler barrel is 1 diameter, carries right through. On the more recent locos that we've built, including the James Spooner, there is actually a tapered section of boiler barrel just here. This is the boiler clack arrangement. This is where the water is fed in through a non-return valve, we call it a clack, and then a shut-off valve here. So the water's fed in up here, which is away from the firebox, which is better for the boiler water. Rather than feeding it directly into the hottest part of the boiler, it's taken to a cooler part. Here's a dome. Well, this is a dome cover, but there's a projecting part of the boiler called the dome under there. It's got a safety valve on top, exactly the same at the other end. Whistle you can see there, I think that's a XLMS Stania hooter whistle, so obviously not an original feature on the Merthin, but does the job. And obviously the 2 cab windows, which have can be folded right back down if you want to, but it makes them rather vulnerable, so they are hinged and clipped so they only open part of the way. They used to be bigger, and I believe there was an idea that you could get out in an emergency if your loco's stuck in the tunnel. I'm not sure I certainly wouldn't get through one of them.